They were still joking about the cheap export jet when the radar warning screamed to life. In the cockpit of a NATO fighter cruising confidently over neutral airspace, the pilot's heart skipped. A tone, short, sharp, followed by a hard lock, the kind you don't ignore. It wasn't supposed to be able to do that. Back at the airbase, no one had taken Pakistan's JF-17 seriously. Too light, too slow, too budget, they said. The American colonel even chuckled. We've got drones scarier than that. But now, at 32,000 feet, with a missile system spooled and a targeting reticle painted across his HUD, that same colonel's jet was being tracked. And the worst part? He had no clue how the JF-17 had gotten that close, or why it hadn't fired yet. They laughed when it first entered the sky, sleek, small, and too cheap to matter. The joint exercise had just begun over contested airspace, and NATO's elite squadrons moved like they owned the clouds. American F-16s, French Rafales, and British Typhoons filled the horizon, weaving in formation with practiced arrogance. And then it happened. A soft chirp inside the colonel's cockpit turned into a blaring tone. Locked. Not a simulated ping, a full radar-confirmed hard lock. What the hell is that? He muttered, eyes scanning the heads-up display. A red triangle blinked, dead center. His jet was being tracked, not from above, not from behind, but from below. 32,000 feet under NATO air control, a single JF-17 Thunder had acquired him. The colonel's voice cracked over comms. I've got a hard lock. Confirm source. Static, then silence. Down below, inside the Thunder's cockpit, there was no panic. The Pakistani pilot's fingers hovered steadily over the stick, eyes calm, breath measured. His targeting system was stable. His instructions had been clear. He wasn't to fire, only to let them know, we see you, and we are ready. At that moment, the laughter stopped. The skies grew quiet, and somewhere inside a NATO command center, a screen turned red. Because no one had expected that jet, the one they mocked, to be this close, this precise, or this silent. And no one had an answer for it. It started months before the exercise, on defense panels, in hangars, and behind closed doors. At a NATO strategy conference in Brussels, an American analyst chuckled as he waved off Pakistan's JF-17 Thunder on a presentation slide. It's a budget build. Chinese base, Pakistani Polish. Looks fast on paper, but won't survive a real scramble. The room agreed. Quiet snickers followed. In the French Air Force, a test pilot was asked about the Thunder. He scoffed. Against a Rafale? Please, we'd finish our coffee before we'd finish that fight. Even among supposed allies, the tone was the same. JF-17 wasn't feared, it wasn't respected, it was dismissed. In international magazines, words like export toy, overhyped, and barely Gen 4 were casually thrown around. Few bothered to research its upgraded Block 3 suite. Fewer still knew how much time its pilots were logging in mountain airspace, where radar broke and instincts mattered more. And those who laughed the loudest? They weren't ready for pilots who had trained in silence, without simulators, without headlines, without the luxury of overconfidence. Because while the West held air shows, Pakistan was flying low through ravines, painting invisible targets on enemy radar, and teaching its young aviators to strike with one rule. You get one shot. Make it count. Back then, no one took that seriously. Until the joint drill was announced. Until the JF-17 was invited. And until one pilot with no call sign, no patch, and no press briefing was told quietly by command, "You'll be flying an exercise Sky Shield. We trust you know what to do if they tee." Saint you. What they didn't know was that he had already run this mission 50 times in his head. Exercise Sky Shield wasn't just a drill. It was a message. 15 nations, 400 aircraft, dozens of real-time satellites watching every move. The skies above the Mediterranean had become a chessboard of alliances and quiet rivalries. NATO pilots polished their helmets. Journalists whispered about who would dominate the scoreboard. No one mentioned the JF-17. They didn't need to. Pakistan's invite had come late, quiet, almost ceremonial. A single squadron, 2 aircraft, not even listed on the public brief. The lead jet never showed, grounded due to a mechanical issue, according to NATO. Only one JF-17 took off that morning, alone, unannounced, underrated. At exactly 0942, Zulu, it slipped into the sky. No formation, no wingman, no fanfare. But someone was watching. Inside an underground control room in Islamabad, a flight commander leaned toward the radio, expression unreadable. He's entered the airspace. We don't expect them to engage, but if they do, show them what they've forgotten. Up in the clouds, the JF-17 adjusted its trim. The pilot didn't speak. He didn't need to. To the rest of the world, it was a dot on the radar. To the NATO pilots above him, it was invisible, too far, too quiet, too irrelevant. And yet, with every passing second, it drifted closer. Not by mistake, not by chance, by design. Because the Pakistani pilot knew the rhythm of NATO formations, he studied them, frame by frame, night after night, until he could predict their shifts like a heartbeat. At 32,000 feet, a U.S. colonel was laughing over comms about his wingman's coffee order. Below them, the JF-17 armed its radar and waited. He didn't need permission. He needed the perfect angle, and NATO had just given it to him. High above the sea, the NATO formation moved like a parade. The F-16s in diamond shape, Typhoon escort off the left wing, AWACS loitering miles behind, feeding them data. They were cruising, not hunting. It was supposed to be a show of presence, not readiness. But someone else was already hunting. The JF-17 flew lower, slower, ghosting their path at the edge of their radar horizon. Not enough to trigger warning, not enough to appear aggressive, just enough to calculate. The Pakistani pilot's eyes stayed locked on the distance. He wasn't chasing the F-16s. He was waiting. At precisely 0958, Zulu, the diamond formation banked slightly northeast. The AWACS shifted coverage. For just 7 seconds, a gap. One the NATO systems wouldn't even log. That was enough. The JF-17 surged upward. In the F-16 cockpit above, Colonel Mason glanced at his HUD. Still clear, his voice came through the radio. Formation stable, going to swing north over segment Delta. Still no visual on guest assets. Guest assets. That's what they called Pakistan's flight team. But his smile faded as his threat warning receiver beeped once, then twice, then locked red. Target acquired. Mason blinked. Control, I've got a hard spike. Confirm contact. Is this part of the script? Static. Then another tone, faster this time. His HUD lit up with a threat vector from below. 35 degrees low, 1 o'clock. The JF-17 had climbed through the gap, used the radar blind spot, and now had him boxed. The Pakistani pilot didn't speak. He just hovered the reticle steady. His finger never touched the trigger. He was locked in, and watching. Above, Mason's heart pounded. His voice was thin. I've got a live radar track. Repeat, live. This is not a drill. He wasn't just being tracked. He was being outplayed. The next move would change everything, because this time, the world was watching. Colonel Mason's voice cracked again, this time louder. I said I'm locked. I've got a hard lock from an unknown, possibly hostile, asset. Where's my override? Where is AWACS? He wasn't shouting to be dramatic. He was shouting because he had never seen this before. Not in drills, not in combat, not from a so-called budget fighter. Inside the NATO command center, analysts scrambled. Screens lit up in real time. One technician zoomed in on the radar trace. The JF-17 was no longer passive. It had closed the gap in less than 30 seconds and locked on from a blind vector. Sir, the Pakistani jet has an active fire control lock on Colonel Mason. The room fell silent. On the screen, the F-16's threat monitor glowed red. A British air marshal leaned forward, whispering, "Tell me this is part of the scenario." But it wasn't, because this wasn't a drill. The JF-17 wasn't simulating a threat. It was simply demonstrating one. Up in the cockpit, Mason's breathing grew shallow. He banked left gently, but the triangle followed. The Thunder's lock held steady. Not aggressive, not twitchy, just precise. Then, to his shock, the tone stopped. The radar warning faded. The lock released. He blinked. No missile, no warning shot, no retaliation. The JF-17 had pulled the trigger on restraint. Because the pilot inside wasn't there to escalate. He was there to make a point. You were vulnerable. I found you, and I let you go. Back in Islamabad, the operations lead spoke softly into the private channel. That's enough. Disengage. The Pakistani pilot eased the stick, rolled off vector, and descended. No comms, no trace, just silence. But the message had already thundered across every screen in the command room. This jet can reach you, and this pilot knows when to stop. But while the lock was gone, the panic was not. And NATO's top brass wanted answers, fast. The radar low, it was gone. But the silence it left behind, it echoed louder than any missile ever could. Inside the NATO Coordination Center, chaos simmered beneath the surface. Officers gathered around digital projections, trying to make sense of what just happened. Comms replayed on loop. Analysts were pulling telemetry, trying to disprove what they already knew. Colonel Mason had been locked by a JF-17, and not just locked, but tracked with clinical precision. A German liaison muttered under his breath, "Was that an accident?" "No," replied the British Air Marshal. "That was a warning, and a damn elegant one." Someone at the table slammed a hand on the desk. "That shouldn't be possible. How did it bypass our early warning layer? Why didn't AWACS detect it sooner?" A young systems officer spoke up, hesitant. The JF-17 came up through a known dead cone. They knew our timing. It exploited a 7-second blind spot. No violation, just brilliance. The room fell quiet again. Across the ocean, headlines hadn't broken yet, but encrypted NATO channels were already buzzing. Messages marked urgent. Subtexts that read, "Unknown capability, must reassess." In the air, Colonel Mason broke radio silence. "Thunder pilot, this is Eagle 1. You have my respect. Repeat, respect. Over." No reply came, because the JF-17 was already gone. Dropped altitude, cut power, turned gently west. Observers later said it looked almost poetic, how it never punched through the clouds, never blared its engines, never lingered. It just came, delivered its message, and disappeared. Back in Islamabad, the pilot removed his helmet in the hangar. A junior officer asked, "Did you engage?" He smiled faintly. "No need. They got the point." But behind closed doors, the world's top commanders were already meeting. Not to retaliate, but to reassess everything they thought that they knew about Pakistan's skies. 2 hours after the radar incident, a secure meeting was convened at a NATO Forward Operations Center. No cameras, no press. Just silence, and one paused frame on a massive screen. A still image from the F-16's HUD, the red triangle blinking over the JF-17. A French general leaned forward, squinting. "How did they even do this?" A systems analyst answered flatly, "That's not a stock radar, and that's not a basic pilot." The JF-17 had been dismissed as a budget craft, a Frankenstein blend of Chinese frames and Pakistani electronics. What they didn't know was that this specific jet, Block 3 configuration, had been outfitted with a homegrown AESA radar system designed for stealth tracking and signal hopping. It didn't just detect targets. It read them, adapted, and then vanished before traditional systems could respond. And the pilot? His file came up redacted on every Allied intelligence request, unnamed in NATO's shared database. No call sign, no recorded deployments. Just a tag, Lead 221 Squadron. Unofficially, he'd flown over disputed terrain more than any NATO pilot in the last decade, trained on old Soviet hardware, hunted drones with his eyes when radars failed, and once, during an exercise in Skardu, he'd tracked a drone visually for 19 minutes without a single system assist. NATO had trained in simulators. He'd trained in storms. Now, the same people who mocked the thunder were quietly revising their protocols. Colonel Mason, he didn't need a report. He'd felt the lock himself. When later asked what it was like, he said only this. "It was like someone tapped me on the shoulder mid-flight and whispered, 'Checkmate.' And just like that, the JF-17 wasn't a joke anymore. It was a warning the skies wouldn't forget. But it wasn't about the jet or even the radar. It was about the pilot and the message he left behind. The official NATO report would never name him. The telemetry would never leak. and the world's defense briefings would bury the incident beneath terms like simulated threat behavior and non-hostile radar activity. But among the pilots who flew that day, the story spread like wildfire, quietly, off-record, in locker rooms and hangars across bases in Europe and the Middle East. The day the jet they laughed at locked onto one of their own, held him steady, then let him go. It wasn't just a move, it was a message. That precision doesn't always come with a billion-dollar price tag. That respect isn't claimed in boardrooms. It's earned in silence, under pressure, 32,000 feet above politics. Back at the Pakistani airbase, the pilot never spoke to the media. He wasn't debriefed on television. No medals, no chest thumping. He returned his helmet, logged his flight hours, and walked out of the hangar alone. But the engineers noticed something strange. A small symbol had been painted near the intake of his jet. A triangle. Red. Just like the lock that had once lit up a NATO HUD. No words, no initials. Just that shape and the quiet history behind it. Somewhere in a NATO base, Colonel Mason still flies, still commands. But whenever a new pilot joins his wing, he tells them one thing before they ever touch the controls. Respect every dot on the radar, especially the ones they laugh at. Because now, they all remember. They laughed at Pakistan's jet, until its lock-on sent a NATO pilot into panic. And after that day, no one laughed again.